Thank you for coming to hear me talk about my book. My name's Hannah Priest, and I am the manager of the Pankhurst Museum. But I'm going to be talking about a very different museum tonight. So my book is Unburied, the true story of Hannah Beswick, the Manchester mummy. Some people might be familiar with the name Hannah Beswick or the a vague idea of the story. Hopefully, by the end of tonight, and after you've read my book, you'll you'll realize that what you thought you knew wasn't true. But for those of you who don't know what the story is, in 1835, Manchester's Natural History Society opened the doors of its purpose-built museum for the first time to some members of the public. And on display, as you walked through that door, were three mummies. One was an ancient Egyptian mummy, one was an ancient Peruvian mummy, and one was a woman from Cheetham Hill who was mummified by a doctor. And you thought your GP was bad. So, and that's Hannah. That's Hannah Beswick. Now, this museum was literally round the corner from here. So it was on Peter Street. Now, I don't know if the little square's going to... No, you can just see it. Have a look as you walk down Peter Street. One of the side streets is called Museum Street, and that is the reason. It confuses a lot of people. It's been called Museum Street since the 19th century, but there hasn't been a museum there since 1868. That's where this building was, the Natural History Society's museum. This is actually the third premises they had. They started in one of their members' houses on St Anne's Square, then they moved to King Street, and then they had this museum built in Peter Street. So why was a woman from Cheetham Hill mummified by her doctor and put in a museum? And so there's lots of places where I could start this story, but since this is Manchester Histories, and since we're just around the corner from where the museum was, and because later on this year, perhaps Manchester Histories might be thinking quite a lot about civic pride. We're looking forward to things like the town hall reopening soon. I thought we could talk a little bit about Manchester and Manchester's civic pride and why civic pride involves mummifying a woman. So the actual title of today's talk is The Ghastly Find at Cheetham, Body Snatching, Manchester and the Return of the Repressed. So our story actually starts not around the corner from here, but Cheetham Hill. And assuming that most of you vaguely know where Cheetham Hill is. As someone from North Manchester, I always have to check. Anyone ventured north? So our story actually starts here in a Tudor manor house called Cheetwood Old Hall. No, it's not there anymore. It looks like that now. Is anyone familiar with Derby Street on Cheetham Hill? Don't Google it. Once upon a time, it was better known as being where Cheetwood Old Hall was. It was on, for those of you who want more specifics, it was on the corner of Derby Street and Sherborne Street. Now, the name Derby Street should give away who owned that part of Cheetham. It was actually the Earl of Derby, which is why you've got the Derby Arms, which is Holt's pub, and where you've got Derby Street. The Earl of Derby owned this land. Now, Hannah Beswick's family had the leasehold on Cheetwood Old Hall for many, many generations. That was her family's home, and they had it leasehold from the Earl of Derby. And it was, if we go back to when Hannah was alive, so Hannah lived from the 1690s to the 1750s, so Georgian period really. In the Georgian period, this was a Tudor manor house surrounded by farmland that Hannah's family would have rented out. They would have had tenant farmers on there, and they would have got there. That's how they would have made their income. And it was quite a lot of income. When Hannah's dad died, he had in his will, he left £60 in a bag at home, and £100 in another bag at home, and £200 in a bag under my bed. And this is in 1706, he wrote that will. So if you work out how much cash he's got just under his bed, that's mostly coming from renting out farmland here and in Hollingwood as well. And that's what Cheetham was like when Hannah lived there. Just down from where Cheetwood was the lovely, actually very attractive and very desirable village of Strangeways. Hannah's cousin married a gentleman of Strangeways. Now, I think that might have been one of the last times you could say that and it not mean something rather different. So this area, it wasn't part of Manchester. These were villages on the outskirts of Manchester, and they were countryside villages with farmland. Obviously, things started to change with the Industrial Revolution. It really, pre-Victorian, and Cheetham was being parts of Cheetham were being incorporated into Manchester. Then you've got the roads being good links for industrial traffic, so to Bury, for example, and then from Bury to the rest of Lancashire or back again. You've got things like that desirable village of Strangeways being that land being used to create Her Majesty's prison, as it was then. Then it was his, then it was hers, now it's his again. And Cheetwood continued, though. Cheetwood carried on as fairly leafy and fairly nice until 1890. And there were some houses sort of encroaching. There were some schools being built. You know, you've got that kind of encroaching domesticity. But the hall was still there, uninhabited. And a lot of the fields around it were still there. But in 1890, the Earl of Derby, and this happens in a few places, and there's two people in the audience who have come and wandered around Bailey's Wood with me, and so we'll know that this happened with a few of what we call the post-medieval manorial system in Manchester, where you get these lovely houses that are Tudor, that continue for a time until the Victorian period, when you've got just a different kind of class system, a different kind of wealth. Nobody wants a Tudor manor house surrounded by fields. It's very difficult to manage, and they certainly don't want it in North Manchester. So the Earl of Derby realised that there was something much more valuable than this house. The soil here is clay. Manchester is building like crazy. What does Manchester need? Bricks. What does clay make? Bricks. So a huge amount of the Earl of Derby's land was actually turned over to brickworks. And you can see it on the Ordnance Survey maps. You can see it sort of encroaching around Hannah's old house. Now, bear in mind, she died in 1758. It's going to be important for what happened next, which, as they say, will shock you. So in 1890, the Earl of Derby decided, finally time to let go of the old Tudor manor house. We'll pull down Cheetwood Hall and we'll dig up the land for clay. Quite a few other places in Manchester, around the suburbs of Manchester, the same things were happening. So the pleasure gardens at Collyhurst, there was a pleasure gardens at Collyhurst, I promise you, was dug up for clay as well. Or for sand, actually, specifically for sand. The clue's in the fact that it's on Sand Street. But here it was clay. And so in July 1890, they started digging up for clay. And this is what happened. Two labourers named John Fogg and John Clark, who were employed at a brickworks off Derby Street, Cheetham, made a dreadful discovery while following their employment on Tuesday morning. The works are situated in the middle of a plot of vacant land, which is bounded on one side by Derby Street and on another side by the high wall, which runs along the rear of Strangeways Prison. In the course of the operations at the brickworks, it was found necessary, in order to maintain a supply of clay, to pull down Cheetwood Hall, an ancient building which was at one time a picturesque landmark. The old structure with its latticed windows and timber supports was, as we have stated, demolished so that its site might yield material for the brickmakers. Clay getting went on uneventfully until Tuesday morning, when the two workmen made a discovery of a startling character. While digging away at a depth of 4 or 5 feet from what was once the ground floor of the old hall, they met with an obstruction. It turned out to be a wooden coffin of medium length. With some difficulty, they succeeded in recovering it from the clay in which it was firmly embedded, and proceeding further in their investigations, they opened the shell to find inside an oblong leaden box. On the box being opened, it was seen to contain what are believed to be human remains, although as yet no definite opinion can be expressed upon the point. The appearance they presented is described as tinned salmon. And one strange and unaccountable circumstance is that no bones were seen. It should be stated, however, that only a cursory examination was made, one probable reason for which is that the stench which issued from the box when it was open was almost overpowering. Although the coffin was of medium size, the leaden box in which the supposed remains were found is not more than 4 feet in length, and its shape does not bear any resemblance to the cases which are usually prepared for the reception of human remains. Ooh. The red's me, by the way, that it wasn't like that in the Middleton Guardian. The house was formerly occupied by a Dr. White, who lived there for many years in the old body snatching days, when considerable difficulty was experienced in securing bodies for dissection. From the appearance of the contents of the coffin and the absence of skull or bones, Superintendent Godby has come to the conclusion they are portions of bodies which have been taken to a doctor's house for the purpose of dissection. So, yeah, that's Derby Street. So, there's a few things to say. The first one is to talk about who Charles White was. It's Charles White. He's going to come back later on. Charles White was many things, but for now, he was the founder of, the relevant bit now is that he was the founder of Manchester Infirmary, now Manchester Royal Infirmary. And as the Middleton Guardian, what the Middleton Guardian is doing, the reason why I was reading from that story is that this story appeared in bits and in dribs and drabs throughout the week. So there's quite a lot of different stories in different newspapers. Middleton Guardian, as if knowing I would need this one day, published a summary on the 5th of July that just gathered everything up. So that's why I'm reading that story. So Charles White is the founder of the Royal Infirmary. He's also the man that mummified Hannah Beswick. Now, notice the Middleton Guardian said he lived there. They also said it. Whose remains are now unearthed, and why were they so disposed of? Is it possible that the coffin contains the corpse of the said Miss Beswick, and that the reputed mummy was simply a make-up, a make-believe for some other reason? It is notorious that Miss Beswick's mother, Patience, whose husband John died in 1705, disappeared. No one knows how, and it is suggested that she may have met with foul play and that the remains now found be hers. Now, what followed after this was, I don't know if you've noticed, but when there's a news story like that, people do like to insert themselves into it. Now, they didn't have Facebook comments then. They had letters to the Middleton Guardian. And a lot of people, so there were some people who said absolutely, definitely that Patience was murdered by a butcher from Ashton-under-Lyne, and that was well known. And bear in mind, 1705, this is 1890. You know, people were saying, I heard the gossip. I mean, who says they heard gossip that was nearly 200 years? Oh, you know. Also people saying they were related to the family, either related to Patience or related to Hannah. Someone wrote in and said that Hannah was a relation of her mother's. How old are you? She died in 1758. How did she know your mum? But they also made this claim that the mummy, which the mummy of Hannah Beswick, so it was 110 years in between Hannah's death and her being buried. She was buried in 1868. So 110 years of her being out of the grave, mummified. And a lot of people were claiming that this proves that that wasn't really the mummy of Hannah Beswick, that this is the body of Hannah Beswick. But what I want to talk about for the Manchester part of the story is that phrase that the Middleton Guardian used about when Charles White lived at Cheetwood Hall. I want to talk about the old body snatching days and what that actually means. Now, you might be familiar with the idea of body snatching. You might be familiar with these guys. They weren't body snatchers. Sorry, I've been around a lot of people who do a lot of research about corpses, anatomy, body snatching, and it's like, you never say Burke and Hare is body snatchers. But this Burke and Hare, probably the most famous popular culture body snatchers. They weren't body snatchers because they found it easier just to murder people and just cut out the middleman. But they were sort of trying to tout themselves as a particular type of body snatcher. So there's two types of body snatcher. One is the literal body snatchers. They would intercept a funeral and take the body before it could go into the ground. And then there was the ones who would dig up bodies. So the ones, and some body snatchers were actually sort of state sanctioned, allowed, because they were taking the bodies of executed criminals from the gallows and taking them, so the beadles would take them to the anatomist. Resurrection men dug up graves. So resurrection men would wait until after someone was buried and dig them up. Burke and Hare were advertising themselves as resurrection men, but they weren't. We don't know the names of a huge number of body snatchers, to be honest, partly because an awful lot of them used code names. They weren't using their real names because they were operating very, well, mostly criminal, to be honest. But we do know the names of the men who paid them. So these are probably the two most famous people who employed resurrection men or other body snatchers. So we have on that side, sorry, I don't actually know my left from right, but over there, we have Robert Knox, who is the man who was paying Burke and Hare to provide him with bodies. And this is John Hunter of the Hunterian Museum in London, who was the most notorious employer of body snatchers and resurrection men in Georgian London. He famously intercepted the funeral of Charles Byrne, who was known as the Irish Giant. John Hunter had tried to buy Charles Byrne's body before he died. He was trying to get him to agree to leave his body. And he said, no, I want to be buried at sea. And his friends were carrying the coffin and they were distracted, and John Hunter's men took the body. That skeleton is still in the collection at the Hunterian Museum. It's only in the last 2 years that they've taken it off public display. John Hunter famously said that there wasn't a man of any class or status that he couldn't body snatch, which did scare the hell out of the Parliamentary Select Committee that was meeting about this. Now, a key date for all of this is 1745. These men were involved with the foundation of the College of Surgeons, now the Royal College of Surgeons. What happened in 1745 when you get the start of the College of Surgeons, prior to that, you've got really two kinds of medicine. In that continued like this for a while. You have physicians and you have surgeons. Now, the physicians were university educated. They knew their Latin and Greek medicine. They would do practical training, but an awful lot of it would be academic learning. So it had to be done in an academic setting. The surgeons were aligned with the barbers up until 1745. And just a fun fact, why barbers and surgeons worked together, why it was the same job. goes back to medieval monasteries. And barbers were well known when they went into the monasteries for their precision and manual dexterity, because they were shaving the monks' tonsures. And I guess someone at some point thought, well, if you can do that, probably lance a boil as well. We can probably trust you. And so that kind of surgery grew out of that. In 1745, the barbers and the surgeons split. Barber surgeon became quite an untrustworthy thing. If you think of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, that was your kind of image of the barber surgeon as being untrained and dangerous, and also, you know, don't eat Mrs. Lovett's pies. But surgeons wanted to be seen as a academic medical profession for the first time, equal to physicians, but they did practical anatomy. That was what they did. Surgery was all about the practical physical manipulation of the body, or wounds of the body, or things in the body, whereas physicians was like what we might think of now as medicine. And so there was a big push around 1745, basically to get surgery taken as seriously as the physicians, the College of Physicians. So men like Knox and Hunter and his brother William Hunter were really at the vanguard of pushing surgery as a proper type of medicine. And it was becoming more and more popular. Simon Chaplin has said that the courses that these men run, because they had to train new surgeons, and they ran courses that were for university students, wannabe doctors, but also members of the public as well, to learn about anatomy and surgery. And the courses that they put on, together with the clinical instruction offered in charitable hospitals, like the most famous being Bart's in London. It still is very famous as a training hospital. These were the main reasons why so many would-be practitioners flocked to London. Over 10,000 young men signed up as hospital pupils in London between 1750 and 1815, and it is likely that many more attended extramural lectures. Medical education at that time was like the Wild West. The College of Surgeons was trying to regulate people from doing their own freelance surgery workshops. They were advertising them as anyone who just wants to see some surgery. They were doing courses for women. I know, shocking. 10,000 young men flocked to London. Now, at the time, if you wanted to become a doctor, whether we're talking physician or surgeon, your options were very limited. So that because there were hardly any universities in the country. So your options were to go to Oxford or Cambridge, which you could only do if you were Anglican. Now, I don't know if anyone knows a city where an awful lot of very wealthy people weren't Anglican. So if you're Methodist or Wesleyan, as a lot of the powerful people in Manchester were, couldn't go to Oxford and Cambridge. London only got its university in the mid-18th century, but it did have its hospitals. It did have hospitals like Bart's. Your other option was to go to the Scottish universities, and an awful lot of young men who wanted to be doctors from somewhere like Manchester would go to Scotland, usually Glasgow or Edinburgh. Knox, obviously, is very famously in Edinburgh, but William Hunter was based in Glasgow, so a lot of young men went to Glasgow to train with William Hunter. But 10,000 young men wanting to be hospital pupils. I don't know if you know how you learn anatomy between 1750 and 1815, how they would teach you what it's like inside a human body. But it did involve a human body. The courses that they were offering were dissection. They all involved dissection. Now, they may use specimens that had been taken from a previous dissection, and all of the teachers, the surgeon anatomists, ran courses on how to prepare your own specimens. So William Hunter was training students not just to dissect, but also to prepare their own specimens, wet or dry. And they were getting really good at, like, you know, very, very thin tissue samples, that sort of thing, because you could use those in more than one lesson. They would have a longer useful purpose. But on the whole, you needed quite a fresh supply of bodies. Now, I don't know if you know much about population at the time, but acquiring 10,000 dead bodies between 1750 and 1815 is a challenge. There were quite a lot of men who seemed up for rising to the challenge. And so these are the old body snatching days. This is when body snatching was essentially out of control. So few key dates that are important to know about the old body snatching days. 1745 is the separation of the barbers and the surgeons, when the surgeons form their own college and start taking formal surgery anatomy training seriously. And the need for a supply of bodies grows almost exponentially if you think those 10,000 people going to London. In 1749, we have the biggest. There were several others, what's called the Tyburn riot. At the time, it was fair game, executed criminals to be cut down from the gallows, shoved straight in the beadle's cart and taken to the anatomist. That was where one of their big sources of corpses came from. But of course, the relatives of the executed might not like that, and so they would quite often attack the beadles to grab the body of their loved one back. And in 1749, that resulted in a major fight, which we call the Tyburn riot, which led to 1751, the Murder Act. An act that stated that if you were convicted and executed for murder, you would be dissected publicly, because hanging wasn't enough. You had to have the public shame of your body being dissected. So relatives couldn't pull your body off the gallows anymore, because if you were hanged for murder, you would be dissected. It turns out, though, because as you'll see, the problems continue quite a lot. Clearly, it was either not that many people were murdering people, or this was a really good deterrent, because they still kept running out of bodies. Burke and Hare were capitalising on this kind of fury for bodies by killing people, and they realised they could get cash for bodies. So between 1751 and 1828 is really when your old body snatching days are, when you've got this absolute frenzy. You can see these are very, very similar dates to when you've got that exponential rise in the number of men wanting to train to be doctors in London. The Burke and Hare murders, and also some concerns around people like John Hunter, led to these concerns happening in the 1820s, leading to a parliamentary committee. Basically, what do we do about body snatching? Between 1830 and 1832 across the country, but mostly in industrial cities, so mostly in the north, were a series of riots, the cholera riots, and Manchester had them. And the biggest one probably was on Angel Meadow, if you're familiar with Angel Meadow, the slum near Rochdale Road. So there were cholera epidemics happening quite a lot. And there were very, very big cholera epidemics with huge amounts of death. Now, I don't know if anyone can think back to, I don't know, 2020 to 2021. When there is an epidemic, or indeed a pandemic, fears and anxieties and a tendency towards conspiracy theories or believing that they are doing something that you don't know about do tend to spread. And this was very, very true in the cholera riots. There was a massive distrust of doctors during the cholera riots. Weirdly, not a massive distrust of the mill owners that weren't keeping sanitary conditions for their workers, leading to the outbreaks of cholera. But let's blame the doctors. However, when I get to the punchline of this, you'll blame the doctors too. One of the things they were worried about was the speed at which cholera victims were being buried. So there was an awful lot of concerns and kind of anxieties in the popular consciousness that doctors were declaring people dead when they weren't dead to expedite and speed up. You may remember similar sort of conspiracies were around during COVID. They've been around during plague times as well. This is quite a common conspiracy. The idea that people were rushing burials. There's a very famous picture called Buried Alive, a premature burial of a man in a coffin who's clearly alive. And in French, it says, certified dead by the doctors, cholera. But he's clearly alive. In Angel Meadow, the cholera riot was kicked off because a young boy had died and his family were having him buried. And as the coffin was being taken for burial, his grandfather suspected there was something wrong with the coffin. And they eventually took the lid off the coffin and the boy's head had been removed and replaced with bricks. Bet you can't guess who removed it. A medical student. It was found in his lodgings. Him and a nurse had removed the head for dissection because it was only a poor kid from a slum. And I've got to credit Dean Kirby for his excellent book on Angel Meadow, where I got that story. So when I say that people didn't trust doctors, sometimes they had a bit of a cause to. So you can see that this reached kind of fever pitch, really. The Angel Meadow riots saw the yeomanry being called in, just like at Peterloo, as a result of this. So in 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed. And the Anatomy Act controlled what bodies could be dissected and what bodies couldn't be dissected, and where you could legitimately get bodies from. Workhouses, poorhouses, lunatic asylums, prisons, and executions. What this did was control. It was a really concerted effort to control the use of resurrection men and body snatchers, and essentially it worked. There's no reports of body snatching from about the 1840s in England. It really did control this, and it also solidified the College of Surgeons as the formal education on anatomy. So they were the one with the supply of bodies. Now, obviously, this is very London. Obviously, Birkenhead, we've gone a little bit to Edinburgh. I've mentioned Angel Meadow, but you'll have noticed Simon Chaplin's 10,000 Young Men, that's in London. I've mentioned Bart's. The Hunters were moving between Scotland and London. What does this have to do with Manchester? Well, I don't have any examples from Manchester, but I have a few from around Manchester. Staley Bridge and Mottram. This is a grave from 1829 of a young boy. It's in St Michael with All Angels in Mottram. By a complete coincidence, it's where Hannah Beswick's family's from. But so went to see her grandfather's grave and also this one. So it's a nice little trip to Mottram. This is the grave of Lewis Brierley, who died in 1829. And it is an empty grave, and written on it, on the gravestone, it says, "Though once beneath the ground his corpse was laid, for use of surgeons it was thence conveyed. Vain was the scheme to hide the impious theft, the body taken, shroud and coffin left. Ye wretches who pursue this barbarous trade, your corpses in turn may be conveyed, like his, to some unfeeling surgeon's room, nor can they justly meet a better doom." There's quite a common curse that people would, basically, you're cursing the doctors to be anatomised themselves, to be dissected themselves. And there's an awful lot of writing that does that, that says, you monsters. But, you know, that's Mottram. I think we should go to Manchester and talk about what on earth this has got to do with Manchester and what on earth it's got to do with civic pride. Because, yeah. So Manchester, as we know, is brilliant. Famous for two things, cotton and arrogance. Third best city in the world, apparently. I don't totally buy this because they've spelt San Francisco wrong, but I took this screenshot for a talk. You can see it's from 2021. I can't remember where it's from. I just wanted something that said Manchester's awesome. So Manchester is arrogant. We say things like, "Oh, there's definitely a discussion to be had about what the second city in England is, but I wish London and Birmingham would go away and do it by themselves." We're we're a world-class city. Apparently, we're third behind San Francisco and Amsterdam. Manchester has been on the world stage for quite some time. Since it was Cottonopolis, it's been, for good or bad, on the world stage, but it wasn't always like this. When Daniel Defoe visited Manchester in the 1720s, he found a very different place. It had no MP. I think people forget this, and since I work in the UK's only suffragette museum, trying to explain that before women got the vote, it didn't mean all men had the vote. No one could vote in Manchester because there was nothing to vote for. So no MP, no corporation, no borough charter, no cathedral, not a city, definitively not a city, and barely qualifies as a town. In fact, he called us a mere village. But then he qualified it. Manchester's a mere village, but it is the greatest mere village in England. And what Daniel Defoe is getting at is that it doesn't make any sense what Manchester is doing. All of those things are true, but Manchester in 1720 was behaving as if it was a city when it barely qualified as a town. So it had a collegiate church, which is now the cathedral. Shouldn't have had a collegiate church. It was barely a town. And when I say it was barely a town, so the earliest map of Lancashire that was drawn, the cartographers put Liverpool and then a place beginning with M at the other end of the Mersey. Didn't even write the whole word. Also, Daniel Defoe later on says that if Manchester's the greatest village in England and Liverpool's one of the wonders of the world. Loved it here, didn't he? In the north. So it had a collegiate church. It shouldn't have had a collegiate church. It had several parishes. It shouldn't have had several parishes. It had a larger than expected population. Oh, and that's me just being arrogant. Yes. And so you can see that Daniel Defoe is recognizing something that will one day lead to this picture. Sorry, I thought I had another bullet point. He is recognizing that Manchester is punching above its weight. It's already aiming at things and building things that are bigger than the current population is because it can see where the population growth is going. And this is in the 1720s. So back when Manchester was the greatest village in the greatest village in the greatest village in England, it kind of had this vibe. Maybe no one was actually saying on the sixth day God created Manchester because it was a fairly religious place at the time. But there very much was a sense that Manchester was a city and it was Cottonopolis in waiting. So what could you find in 18th century Manchester? Well, there was no political representation or council. There was no local aristocracy. Now, by that I mean dukes. So dukes don't own Manchester. It's very different to somewhere like Sheffield, for example, where you have dukedoms that have held that land since, in some places, since the conquest. Manchester didn't have that. Apparently, William the Conqueror didn't think it was too important to give away to one of his friends. So there were earls, like the Earl of Derby, but no dukes. The Duke of Bridgewater, who built the canal, came later. Manchester was not owned by aristocracy. There was no university. That's not too much of an embarrassment. There were no universities in England apart from Oxford and Cambridge until either University College or King's College in London. They argue about which one of them was first. So if you go on both their websites, they'll both tell you that they're first. Just like in Manchester, both universities last year said they were 200 years old. Neither of them are. So there was no university, there was no higher education or medical school. So once you'd reached the point of higher education, you had to leave Manchester. You had to go somewhere else. For medical training, Scotland or London was the most common, but for any higher education, you had to leave. And this was frustrating to a number of places, not least Manchester Grammar School, because they were giving this education and they had their kind of their board of trustees that would give these scholarships to young Manchester lads who would then take that learning with them somewhere else. They wouldn't stay in Manchester because you had to go somewhere else to continue your education. Manchester did, though, have an increasing population, both in terms of size and density, even before the Industrial Revolution, or in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Manchester was, textiles were a huge thing, so fustian predated cotton, but textiles had been a big thing. Manchester cottons is actually an early modern term for a type of woolens created in Manchester. It's all to do with, because we get a lot of rain. It's good for fabrics. It's not all to do with that. It's to do with the fact that no local aristocracy is here. So it's also a really good place for entrepreneurs. It's a really good place for people who want to be able to build stuff without needing, because with no political representation, without needing planning permission. If you want to knock a building down and build another one, Manchester's a great city to go to. So the population was increasing. There was the incipient industrialization, and there were, of course, wealth and class divisions. There were also newly created fashionable and wealthy areas, like, for example, King Street and St Anne's Square. Now, St Anne's Square was specifically built to look like the fashionable squares in Bath and London. Do you see how Manchester's punching above its weight? It's decided that it wants to look not like a village that makes a lot of fabric, but to have a square like you would have in Bath. King Street was built shortly afterwards, and it's quite likely that this is rich people having a bit of a tit-for-tat, because one was built by one team and one by another. So one was built by the Hanoverians, the other by the Jacobites, which is how the wealthy people in Manchester drew their battle lines in the 18th century. So Georgian Manchester is not really something that we think about a lot. Manchester is generally treated like a Victorian city, but as if it just sort of emerged fully fledged. But Georgian Manchester had a lot of people who were very involved in trying to put right some of those things that I showed you. So campaigning for a borough charter, it would be 1838 before they got that. Campaigning for a council again, 1838. Acting as though they had a council before they did. Building fashionable squares. Building the collegiate church. Behaving as if it was a city before it was a city. And that also happens with education. And actually Manchester's push to get a university, I personally think, was more sustained than London's. It took longer for Manchester to get one, but they fought harder. And it really started in 1783 when a group of men founded the College of the Arts and Sciences. And this was essentially higher education learning. You couldn't get a degree because it could not award a degree, but you could go to academic higher education lectures on all sorts of subjects, from literature, philosophy, chemistry. There was a lot of chemistry classes, and indeed medicine as well. And they also did classes for women too. The College of the Arts and Sciences didn't last very long because it was so far ahead of its time. Nobody knew what to do with it. And a lot of the wealthy industrialists didn't want to send their sons there because they couldn't see the point of them getting a general university education. So there's records of some of the men in the College of the Arts and Sciences, and indeed Owens College when it was open, having wealthy industrialists saying, I want you to teach my son chemistry, but only the bit he'll need for working in, you know, the family business, the mills and the factories. So the College of the Arts and Sciences was really, really exciting. It was a precursor to Owens College. So the principles of the College of the Arts and Sciences would form into Owens College, which was founded in the 1850s. 1851, I think, is the legacy. That's when Manchester University was started, by the way, not 200 years ago. 200 years ago was the founding of the Mechanics Institute. I've not got it on this slide, but again, Manchester had a very early Mechanics Institute, which was all about the education of the working class as well, the skilled working class. So the Mechanics Institute was offering lectures on art, on history, on natural history, on philosophy. Again, everyone loves a bit of philosophy. So the College of the Arts and Sciences was founded on the same values as Owens College, which would become the University of Manchester. 1781, you've got the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. It's one of the oldest surviving, because it's still going, the Manchester Lit and Phil. It's one of the oldest surviving ones in the country. And again, it was intended for the propagation of knowledge, but also, finally get there, civic pride. That's what these institutions were all about, and the Lit and Phil particularly. So what they're doing is they're showing that Manchester is a city, even though it's not, it's a mere village. But they're showing that Manchester has a literary and academic elite. So not aristocracy and not wealth-based, although it was wealth-based, but not wealth-based, but that Manchester is a powerful proto-city because it has an intelligentsia, basically. So the Lit and Phil starts. It has a spin-off group, which was the Manchester Natural History Society. And that's because some members of the Lit and Phil wanted to buy some insects, and some of the others didn't want to buy some insects. So they formed the Manchester Natural History Society. You can read all about it in the first chapter of my book. It's called Cabinet of Insects. Or you can go to Manchester Museum and see those insects yourself, because the Manchester Natural History Society's museum, eventually its collection went to Owens College, who opened it as Manchester Museum. So you can go and see some of the things. Not Hannah Beswick. So now we've got two intellectual societies in Manchester, but members of the Manchester Lit and Phil were also founding members of the Portico. Pretty much, or I think almost all the founding members of the Portico were also members of the Lit and Phil. They also founded other institutions, including Harris Manchester College, Oxford. And if you wondered why an Oxford college has got Manchester in its name, yes, it's because of this Manchester. This was sort of a group of nonconformists, mostly Methodists, who couldn't go to university because you had to cite the Anglican Creed to go to Oxford and Cambridge. And so they founded their own higher education institution called Manchester Academy. But then they moved it out of Manchester. It went to Warrington. It was still called Manchester Academy. And eventually it ended up being subsumed into the University of Oxford as Harris Manchester. This is also by members of one of the founding members of Harris Manchester College is the guy who wanted to buy the insects when he was in the Lit and Phil. In case you want to know what else he did, as well as buying insects. And in 1752, Manchester Infirmary, which was the third infirmary outside London in the country. And by the country this time, I mean UK. So it was after Edinburgh and Bristol. So infirmaries, these were incredible institutions, incredibly innovative institutions. So London had a couple of infirmaries that had survived from the Middle Ages, particularly the hospitals we know as Barts and Bedlam. Although Bedlam obviously had a specialism. Other places didn't have infirmaries. And one of the reasons was that type of medical care for the poor was something that was provided by chapels up until Henry VIII. And when he dissolved the chapels, the hospitals went. He reinstated a couple in London, but there were no others anywhere else. So in 1752, a group of people got together and decided Manchester should have an infirmary. And an infirmary being free healthcare for the poor. And the wealthy donated to it, and mostly they donated to it because if there was an infirmary, if one of your tenants or someone came to you saying, I'm desperate, I'm really ill, I can't work, you didn't have to give them charity anymore. You could just send them to the infirmary. It opened on, the first Manchester Infirmary opened on near Withy Grove, and it had space for 12 patients. It's now part of the largest hospital trust in the country. I think this might be why we're arrogant. I think occasionally it might be justified. Shortly after this, moved to its longest standing location, which was on Piccadilly Gardens. So it was also a precursor to the Lying In Hospital, now known as St Mary's. The Lying In Hospital was opened in the later 18th century by some of the doctors from the infirmary. And Manchester Infirmary was also the groundwork for formal medical education in Manchester. The reason why, and trust me, if anyone knows where the museum I work at is, you'll know why I know this story. The reason why MRI is where it is, surrounding our little museum, and why they knocked down all the other houses and tried to knock down ours, is because it was, when it had to be moved from Piccadilly Gardens, when it had outgrown Piccadilly Gardens, it was specifically moved to be close to the university so that medical education could be united. So you've got members of the medical society at the university who are also surgeons and doctors at what by then was the MRI. So the Manchester Infirmary was not only Manchester's hospital, it was also the groundwork for Manchester's formal medical education. Now, coming to the end, don't worry. I wonder if you can guess what person was a founding member of the College of the Arts and Sciences, a key member of Manchester Lit and Phil, a donator to Manchester Natural History Society, a member of the Portico, a founder of Manchester Infirmary, and a founder of St Mary's. That's right. It's good old mummifier, Charles White. So Charles White is the figure that is driving medical education in Manchester. In case you've got off on the wrong foot with him because of the mummifying thing. When he founded the line, he was also a midwife. I'll tell you a little bit, I think, about Charles White and his background. So he was the son of a Manchester doctor. His father, Thomas White, was a doctor. He practiced on King Street. King Street, before the banks moved in, and I don't know what it is now, expensive shops and tapas bars, but before that, it was where the medical elite of Manchester lived, in George and Manchester. So Charles White trained under William Hunter. So William Hunter also is the famous anatomist. He's the brother of John Hunter, the famous stealer of Charles Burnham. One of the Hunters, either William or John, sources vary, also mummified a woman, Maria Van Butchell. She was the wife of a dentist, and her husband paid them to embalm her and allegedly kept her on display in his waiting room. So Charles White went to London to train under William Hunter because you had to go to London or Scotland. He went and completed his training in Edinburgh, perfectly normal journey for a wannabe doctor in Manchester. And then he studied under the tutelage of his father. So he did his practical sort of apprenticeship with his father in Manchester at King Street. He was a surgeon and a man midwife, which I think is such a wonderful way of putting it. He was obstetrics. Was his specialism, and I'm going to redeem him slightly. One of the things that concerned Charles White was something called puerperal fever or childbed fever, which was the highest cause of maternal mortality at the time, and the maternal mortality from puerperal fever could go high enough. So this is childbed fever, so women contracting a fever and dying after giving birth. And it got to the point, puerperal fever, its highest peak, was 1 in 100 women died of it after giving birth. And Charles White essentially eradicated it in Manchester. He wrote a guidebook on midwifery, on what to do when treating a woman in childbirth, that contained really quite radical suggestions, like wash your hands. And I'm not kidding. Let her out of bed. It was practiced to keep the woman essentially swaddled in bed, and not let her get up for several days. Open the windows, circulate some air. And Charles White claimed his, between this and between the infirmary and St Mary's, he prided himself on never having lost a mother to puerperal fever. So he mummified one woman, yes, but he probably saved the lives of could be 10,000 women. He practiced in King Street, as I said, and he offered anatomy teaching from his premises in King Street. Remember, he was founder of all those institutions that were pushing for formal medical education in Manchester. He offered practical anatomy teaching in King Street, and later in the Lying In Hospital as well. So he had people coming to learn about anatomy, and he brought in guest speakers like his old friend John Hunter. John Hunter turned up, gave a talk at the Lying In Hospital. And what did he have in his bag? Just a thigh bone to show everyone. And he established a medical museum at King Street. It's on the site of what was the old town hall, the facade of which is in Heaton Park. Before that, it was Charles White's house, and now it's a dentist and hot working. You can book it by the hour if you want to do an office work or something. I don't really know what that is, but it's there. But yes, Charles White's Medical Museum on the corner of King Street and Cross Street was pretty well known. He donated almost all his specimens to St Mary's, to the Lying In Hospital, but they were probably destroyed in a fire. Some specimens were kept elsewhere, hence my book. So back to, just to finish up, back to Cheetham Hill and that weird box of tinned salmon-esque human remains that was dug up. Now you know what the old body snatching days were. Let's return to Cheetwood Old Hall. So when that happened in 1890, sorry, I've just moved on to the wrong side. When the ghastly find happened in 1890, no one was really, they said the old body snatching days, but then they didn't really say much more about it afterwards. And it's not really a story that's told a lot now. It's not what Derby Street's famous for now. And what that box could be, no one was really thinking into kind of 1750s terms. They were thinking in 1890s terms. Now, the specifics of Charles White's career had faded by then. So you notice that it just said a Dr. White, and not what was probably the most preeminent doctor in the city or the village or whatever we were back then. The story of Hannah Beswick by then, she died in 1758, she was buried in 1868, had essentially become the stuff of urban legend. So people could just say whatever they wanted without having any kind of clear idea as to who actually lived in that house. So the newspaper can claim that Charles White lived in that house when it was actually Hannah. And you could get all those strange tales that had been attached to it. The changes to Cheetham were also really dramatic. So if it was difficult, even in 1890, it's impossible now to really imagine where Cheetwood Hall was, and to imagine, you all laughed when I said a nice pretty village of strange ways, because it's impossible to imagine Cheetham Hill like that. The changes to Cheetham were some of the most dramatic in the city. because it happened all at once. And so it was described as devastation. So there's a newspaper article. I've obviously not got time to show you the precursor to the ghastly find. But in June of that year, so a month before they dug the coffin up, the Middleton Guardian did this piece on Cheetwood Old Hall itself, and about what a beautiful relic of the past it was, but how it was being pulled down, and they referred to it as devastation, the devastation of the area, the removal. And it says, we know progress has to be made, but not in Cheetham, it's been at the absolute annihilation of what came before. So it's very difficult to tell this story. And it's not, I'm from Crumpsall, I'm from right next to Cheetham. It's not a local story. Oh, do you remember when they found a body? Well, no, actually, do you remember when they found a body on Derby Street? Do you remember in the past when they found a body on Derby Street? Do you remember when they dug that coffin up? It's not a local story. It's really, really not that well known. Also, by the time that piece was written, you could say the old body snatching days, like something from A Penny Dreadful, because body snatching hadn't been a threat since the 1840s. So you could kind of enjoy the ghoulishness of it without having to stop and think what it might have meant. Formal medical education in Manchester began in 1814. Owens College opened in 1851. So that idea of the body snatchers being a threat was pretty much gone. And Manchester had reimagined itself as a Victorian city. It still is today. That happened quite quickly. Let's forget the Georgian past. There's not an awful lot of Georgian remains in Manchester. There's not a lot of Georgian buildings. I mean, there's one that's also the home of the UK's only suffragette museum, but there's not a lot of Georgian Manchester around. We think of Manchester as Victorian, and while that's quite often us now in the present, looking back, nostalgically, it's also erasing what came before. And I think in 1890, something that came before returned. The old body snatching days. But then no one ever spoke of it again. In case you want to know exactly what happened, that is what happened. The coroner said, what can I do with this? It looks like tinned salmon. Oh, why don't we just throw it away? So they did. And let's never speak of this again. And the Earl of Derby was quite rich and did own quite a lot of land. So I think there was a sense of, let's not say anything about those. Oops, that's me tapping the wrong thing. So, did Charles White engage in body snatching? This is just to finish up because I've gone a bit over time. Did Charles White engage in body snatching? It'd be weird if he didn't. I have no proof that he did, but he was definitely doing anatomy demonstrations in King Street. This much we know. Those bodies had to come from somewhere. And one of the curators of the Natural History Museum, before it went to Owens College, was a doctor in Manchester and had done training in Manchester and did refer to some of the hijinks that went on with stolen bodies and some of the pranks that went on. I think it would be very, very strict. He certainly will have been trained on bodies that had been taken through body snatching or resurrection men, because he trained in London under William Hunter. Did he snatch bodies in Manchester? I think it's quite likely. What exactly was buried under Cheetwood Old Hall? Well, I haven't had time to tell you this, but when I say that Hannah Beswick's body was mummified, it was a very particular technique that was done. It's actually a form of embalming. The technique used was probably a technique pioneered by William Hunter. And we assume that Charles White was following the same technique as the Hunters used on Maria van Butchel. In order to do that type of embalming, it's very similar to modern day embalming because you're using the circulatory system to put preservative chemicals through the body. But one of the things you have to do is remove the internal organs. Now, if you are embalmed in a funeral, and your internal organs are removed, they're normally put in a really nice casket called a viscera box. And a lot of bodies in vaults have got niches in the wall for the viscera box. The viscera box would be much smaller than a coffin, maybe made out of something like lead that would keep any stench out. And then you would choose whether you were going to, because what you're going to do with that, you might want to bury it. So you might want to put that inside a wooden coffin and bury it. Just a theory. Um, was it something to do with Hannah Beswick, the Manchester mummy? Another fact to tell you is that when Hannah died, she did not leave any instructions about being mummified in her will, but she did leave instructions that her best friend, a long-time companion, and her cousin's daughter would, sorry, her cousin, yeah, her aunt's daughter, had to live in her house for a number of years after she died, and only then could they inherit. Now, that process that I told you about of mummification takes at least 2 years for the body to desiccate to the point that Hannah's body was in. I'm just saying, Mary lived with Hannah. They appeared to have been quite close. Hannah chose a path for her body. The viscera box, so there's no funeral. You're living in the house with your best friend, but you have her heart. I mean, other entrails as well, but yeah, her heart in a box. Maybe you bury it. Maybe that was the funeral. Could be. Oh, because the punchline is Charles White never lived at Cheetwood Old Hall, so it can't have been anyone else unless Hannah Beswick was dismembering people. What happened to Patience Buckley? Was she really, I know you've been hanging on this one, was she really murdered by a butcher from Ashton-under-Lyne? No, she moved to Bradford. She's buried in Bradford. You can see her grave. She was not Hannah's mother. She was her stepmother. She married after Hannah's dad died, a man called John Shaw, and they moved to Bradford. The end of Patience. Are there any more ghastly secrets hiding in the city? Yes. Yes. Every time anything is dug up or any renovation work is done, they find bodies under the city. Anyone's going to St. Peter's Square tram stop to go home? You'll be walking over the grave of the man who called in the charge at Peterloo. So give him a stamp as you walk past him. Because when they dug up to build the second city crossing, but then also St. Peter's Square, they disturbed graveyards. Near me, and in the end of the book, I point out it's my local Tesco. Would have been Hannah Beswick's local Tesco as well if she'd lived long enough to see Tesco. Car parks on a graveyard. They had to dig up all the bodies and put them in mass graves in other graveyards. Which did lead to what is quoted in the book, because it was one of the most bizarre headlines, which was Tesco desecrated my grandfather's grave. There are ghastly secrets, but I think the body snatching secrets tell us that, I guess, and I don't want to say you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, but you can't have a university and a medical school and an infirmary without a little bit of body snatching. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for listening. There is obviously the final question of why did Charles White mummify Hannah Beswick? Maybe is what you were hoping to hear tonight. You have to read my book to find out. Did you want me to take some questions, or have you got some on the chat, or? That's a really good question, and it has come up when I've done talks before. So because we don't know the identities, a lot of them would operate. So the gang in Staley Bridge operated under code names, Captain this, and so we don't know the exact makeup of the gangs. But what we do know is, like Burke and Hare, women were involved in the endeavour. They probably wouldn't have dug up the graves, so you wouldn't get resurrection women for the same reason as you didn't get a lot of grave diggers who were women. It's a physical job. But some colleagues who work more in history of anatomy have told me that there are criminal records for women who would they'd go to graveyards and they'd talk to mourners to find out what funerals had happened, because it's easier for a woman to do that. So they would be part of the gang, not necessarily digging up the bodies, but playing a part. And one part they would play is sussing out, because a woman walking around the graveyard by herself is considered less suspicious than a man. Have we got any questions?
I'm really like interested in like the various sort of churches' stance on it, because there's always been an element of some people aren't considered fit enough to have a Christian burial.
Yeah.
So people who've died by suicide, or people who've committed certain sins, unmarried mothers, or what have you. But this is done on a, you know, when you're sort of then talking about the industrialization of that, with people not being allowed to bury family members who've been executed, and then that being then taken away, and just the rationalization of that within a society that is deeply religious. Obviously, there's lots of different sects of Christianity that are kind of springing up during this time. And so I think, yeah, I'm quite interested in how that was sort of squared off, and were there any groups that were kind of speaking up against it?
So yes, there were plenty of people that were, this was not considered, when the surgeon anatomist started doing their lectures, it wasn't wholly accepted, you know, and there's still that air in popular culture, isn't there, that there's something seedy, there's something dark, there's something disturbing about it. But as you say, the country was a Christian country, you know, the laws were being passed, like the Murder Act were being passed, but it was absolutely squared off. So in the Christian traditions that you're talking about, the idea of having a perfect body, an uncorrupted body, was seen as being representative of the uncorrupted soul. And interestingly, around 1745, you also have the commercialization of funeral practices, and people getting really quite obsessed with the idea of embalming, pillows in coffins, making your body look like it wasn't dead, it wasn't corrupted, it wasn't damaged, it was just sleeping. Now that goes hand in hand with it, because if an uncorrupted body is an uncorrupted soul, to deliberately corrupt the body by dismembering it is surely, you are basically affecting that person not just in this life but in the afterlife as well. And so that's why in the Murder Act it's specifically described as an additional punishment. It's not just, oh yeah, we can do this. It says that murderers can be dissected as an additional punishment to the murderer. And if you think about it,
Eternal damnation.
Yeah, basic. Eternal damnation, and also eternal shame.
There's sort of the Catholic element of like people being able to, you know, absolve themselves, you know, last rites, whatever, which of course it's not a Catholic city in the same that other cities are. So that practice is still going to be a minority that would perhaps maybe sort of think that way, that absolving of sins, and that something that can happen. But it's a proper cursing act, isn't it? You're damned in this life and the next. Yeah.
And also shame on your family, because you know these are going to be public dissection, you know. It was, and it's specifically described in the act as an additional punishment. Hanging's not enough. So that's how they were squaring it off in terms of the Christian ideals. But I think it's really interesting that around the time of the old body snatching days, you also have these big changes in funeral practices. Anyone wants to know where you could where you could hire a hearse in Manchester at the time? It was the Old Turk's Head. That's where you got hearses from, was pubs, because at Drayman, pubs were the only places that could stable horses and have carts on hand. So they did anyway. So it's not the Old Turk's Head that's still there. That's the new Old Turk's Head. But these practices were all happening at the same time, and they were coming out of some changes in Christian doctrine, some changes in ideas about the body, because a lot of Christians didn't like that idea of the uncorrupted body as the uncorrupted soul, because that does come from an older Catholic practice. So there were Christian writers who were saying, once your soul is what is important, that's mortal remains, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, doesn't matter. But that was changing funeral practices as well, and it was driving the desire for embalming, because up until that point, only royalty was embalmed, and the royalty was embalmed for practical reasons, nothing to do with Christianity. And if anyone remembers the queue when the Queen died, had she not been embalmed, people at the end of that queue would have got a very different show. And so royalty and the aristocracy were always being embalmed because their funeral would be delayed. As family had to travel, people had to come from overseas, maybe the body. So the Countess of Wilton, as in the owners of Heaton Park, when she was buried in Prestwich near Heaton Park, her body had to be brought from Melton Mowbray to Heaton Park for the funeral, and then her family had to travel from overseas, some of them. So you had to embalm the body to make sure bad things didn't happen. Apparently one monarch exploded when being buried. Sorry. So in a city like Manchester, where you've got incredible social mobility and civic pride, I keep saying it because it's just nice to throw it in whilst also making people go, ugh. Where you've got a city where people are aspiring high, where they're punching above their weight, why would they not want a funeral like someone royal or like a countess? And so you get a lot of these commercial places. So it's not actually anything to do with Christian doctrine, but to do with social climbing. And there were places, the New Tea Warehouse in Manchester was based, and then later on the Mourning Warehouse, and their phone number was something like, I can't remember what it was now, but it was something like just phone death to the exchange. Yeah, because we were completely capitalising on this. The New Tea Warehouse was advertising at this time all the accoutrements of an aristocratic funeral, but at half the price. All you needed was the embalming. All you needed was someone who could embalm you, and you could be buried like a king under a car park. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but it's a really interesting question to me.
They're easy to photograph as well.
Yeah, so that comes later as well. But also things like open casket funerals come later too. The idea of visiting the dead. But yeah, embalming was for royalty and aristocracy was always practical, but it acquired a desirable a sort of quality to it. Did anyone have any other? Sorry, I gave a really long answer to that question. Did anyone else have a question?
No, just thank you. That was fascinating. That was intriguing.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm happy to talk about other things to do with gross stuff that happens at funerals. But yeah, stop me and ask me about tinned salmon. But yeah, there's loads more in the book as well.
Yeah, don't forget 40% off.
Yes, which is Saturday.